Alright, so welcome to my second episode of The Same Night. I have revolutionized how I make these videos. When I was using audio files, I would have to go back and listen to the entire podcast all over again to figure out where I needed to place the images. So I'd have to go in, figure out this is the start of the image, keep listening, edit it there, and keep going. It took forever. But now with the camera, it takes me from like 2 hours of editing time to like 30 minutes. It takes like no time at all. So I can knock these out really quick once I already have the research done and I can start recording. So yeah, should be about another 2 hours before this one's out. It's gonna be great. Now, today's episode is a revamp of the second episode that I posted on this channel, and that was on trenches in the First World War and before. We imagine trenches being almost a World War I invention, right? Like, you had machine guns and artillery fire, trenches sprang up, and they started there. Except they didn't. And there were trenches that worked to very, very effective lengths well before World War I. We're talking centuries beforehand and millennia before that when the first one was made. And it should be talked about more that trenches were used way before World War I. So that's what we're going to talk about today. It's going to be great. Now, starting off, this image on the screen here is an aerial view of a trench line in World War I. And you can see on the left side there's a bunch of, white lines, and in the middle is like this big black strip, and then on the right side is just a ton of other trenches. Now, the white that you see that back marks the black jagged lines denotes that this is towards the middle portion of France. It's really cool. It's a whole other thing though. But these trenches are only really new in the sense of what you can't see in this photograph. The only things that are new in this image are going to be the scale of the trenches, the items inside of the trenches, so the machine guns, the equipment, and also what's beneath the trenches. The dugouts, the size of those would change, the mining tunnels, all of that is new as well. But the actual individual trench itself and dugouts to some degree were not made in World War I. Okay, that's plain and simple. It's really cool. So, talking about the first kind of trench now. Now, when trench warfare really begins decides on what you count trench warfare as. If you think trench warfare is sitting in a trench with a bunch of your best buddies shooting at a different group of people, then trench warfare is going to start a lot later than if you think trench warfare is just a trench being used in warfare. Because if you think a trench being used in warfare counts as trench warfare, then you can say that the first trench was made sometime in 8000 BC near the walls of Jericho. Now, with this beautifully drawn image, you can see what the walls of Jericho would kind of look like. Now, you would have your city here, then you had the walls of Jericho, and then you had a small trench built in front of the walls. And then there'd also be another trench kind of further away as well, as best as we know. And this would slow down defenders. It would make them have to, come down, then back up. They'd have to slow down. If they had horses, the horses couldn't go over the ditch or the trench because it's too deep for them. So it was a way of making a defensive position to slow your enemies. Well, while there was nobody actually inside of this trench, the only purpose this trench had was to slow down attackers. That is still a trench in warfare. So if you count that as trench warfare, then you can say 8000 BC, trench warfare begins. Now, that is the first time that we know of. It is not hard to build a trench like this. It's not hard at all. But this is the first evidence that we have of a trench. Now, the Romans loved making trenches in their wars all over the different continents they fought on. And their trenches were made to delay cavalry charges. Now, the Romans used trenches very, very differently than what Jericho used thousands of years earlier. They used theirs in more of a situational position. Now, if you and your buddies are all archers and you are firing on whatever enemy that you need to take out, and a cavalry unit comes along, you will not be able to take out the cavalry unit before the cavalry unit gets to you and wipes you and your guys out. So the cavalry comes charging across the field. It takes you and your buddies out. Game over. That's it. Well, the Romans decide we can't let this happen, but we still need our archers to be near the front line. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a trench in front of our guys. And now the horse cannot just directly come through our archers. Now the horse is going to have to go around and then behind the archers because the horse can't jump the gap. Well, if the horse has to run all the way around the archers, then that means that the archers will have more time to try and take out this cavalry unit. Also, by the time the horse gets behind it, it cannot do a full cavalry charge because if it does, it's going to run straight into the trench from the other direction. So it can't do a cavalry charge anymore. Even if the cavalry unit manages to get inside of the archer unit, it is now stuck on 3 sides by a trench, meaning other units can come in and take out the horse. So these trenches were used very situationally, and it was very, very effective as far as I know. And it's really fascinating, super cool. And if you want to know exactly which battle that would be, that's the Battle of Dara in 530 AD. Super fascinating stuff. Now, this guy on the screen here is revolutionary when it comes to warfare. This guy, in a very American way of pronouncing it, is Sebastian Lepestre de Vauban. Very, very horribly pronounced. But what you need to know about this guy is that he pioneers trenches as a method of defense from artillery. So it is still being used to attack, but it has been standardized. Now, this guy grows up in nobility, fights a rebel, then gets captured, switches sides, fights some more. This guy's absolutely insane, and then rises through the ranks. And as he's rising through the ranks of this military, he becomes an engineer, and then he becomes an officer in the engineers, and then becomes the engineer. And during the Siege of Maastricht in 1673, he decides, well, we need to take this city. Except if we try to march our soldiers directly towards the city, they are going to get hit by cannon fire. So we have to figure out how to maintain the siege, get our troops to the walls of the city so they can attack the city, but also not be attacked by the artillery. Well, during the siege, he makes this absolutely beautiful trench network. It is 3 lines of trenches, and you can see at the very bottom of the image 2 like zigzagged ways. Those would be what would come as communication trenches in World War I. Very, very thin trenches that would let 1, maybe 2 people, if they squeezed past each other, through at a time. But that also meant that if the enemy inside of that city was firing at you, the odds of that cannonball actually making it down into that super narrow trench is very small. And even if it does, it will be contained because of how zigzagged it is. And then you get to that front line, the one parallel, and this is where you would have your artillery pieces, because even your artillery pieces need to be covered from the artillery in the fort, because this is still an age where you have a cannon and it can fire long distances, but still the closer you get, the more accurate it is, so you still want it to get it close. And then you have the second line of communication trenches leading to the second line, and the second line is where you would line up a lot of your infantry. Then you would have the third line, and the third line during the siege was so close to the walls that the cannons could no longer aim down enough to shoot at the people in the trenches, meaning that they would be under attack by rifle fire or arrow fire if that was even still a thing. And then the fort falls. It is a successful siege because they were protected from the artillery long enough for their artillery to blow a hole in the fort, get into it, and take it over. Now, after this battle, this becomes the standard way of taking a city, almost immediately. This is just the way, because it is so incredibly effective. An attacker can use it to defend, and there's really not much the defender can do about it other than continue to fire and hope that they can, take out the enemy. Super fascinating. Now, even before the Siege of Maastricht begins in 1673, you have on the exact opposite side of the world, exact opposite almost, Maori Paz using very simple trenches to defend from attackers. And it is shocking how accurate they would be to what World War I trenches would look like hundreds of years later. Like, it is scary. So, Maori Pas, or towns and villages, would have a setup that, not all of them, but some of them would look like this. You would have the city, which was protected by very rudimentary walls on top of a hill. Okay. Then you would have one line of trenches, except the first line of trenches, even though it's very rudimentary, has a dugout in it. Each one had dugouts to protect from shell fire, arrow fire, anything else. Very early rudimentary dugouts. And then they had very, very sharp pointy sticks in front of the trench lines to slow down attackers, because then the attackers have to screw around with the sticks, trying to get the sticks moved off the battlefield, which means that you have more time to take out the attackers. And they had levels to it too. There were multiple lines of trenches in the Maori Pas as well. Hundreds of years before World War I, long before the standardization of trenches at the Siege of Maastricht, and opposite side of the world. Absolutely fascinating. And at Gate Pa in 1864, you have a British naval invasion of this town, and a Maori network consisting of multiple lines of trenches and dugouts and bunkers managed to hold off and survive an hours-long naval bombardment by big naval cannons at the time. And then once the British come in, thinking that they are going to just be able to roll in because there's no way that the natives could survive that, they get absolutely slaughtered because the Maori people are built in trenches and bunkers all over the place. And they don't even know where these bunkers and trenches are. And there are reports of several British soldiers being shot from below because they don't even know where the enemy is. And they repel the British successfully. It is absolutely fascinating. This happens during the same time as the American Civil War. Super cool stuff to look at, and they absolutely deserve more attention for that too. Now, in 1854, you have Russia, which is currently under attack by both the French and the British at the same time. And at the port city of Sevastopol, which is modern-day Ukraine, they build huge lines of trenches and communication trenches and reserve trenches in preparation for the siege that is to come very soon. And they build kind of an equivalent of a bunker. It's called a redoubt. It's basically like a fortified position. And they reinforce the trenches with wood, and they reinforce the trenches with anything they can find nearby. They connect the trenches to these reinforced positions. They bring up siege guns to put behind their trench network to fire on any attackers coming in. They dig trenches facing other trenches to make lines of trenches. Well, then the attacking force shows up, and the attacking force also brings up large siege guns and digs in there with their own trenches, and they reinforce their own trenches with their own wood and anything else they can find. The attacking British and French make railway systems to the battlefield on narrow gauge railways to get supplies closer to the front. And it becomes this bogged down siege for over a year. And this huge, massive siege sees trenches flood and collapse throughout the winter. It sees diseases in the ranks. It sees, hunger issues because nobody can get food. You see British soldiers legitimately go over the top. They go up over the trenches into what was now no man's land on direct assaults on Russian trenches and are thrown back due to attacking fortified positions. And the Russians lose 100,000 soldiers. They do end up losing the city. But as you can see in this photograph here, that is a picture-perfect trench. They have a firing step. They have a lowered area. You can see it's reinforced. This is a trench 70 years before trenches were used much more widespread. But it absolutely counts. And it is fascinating to look at. Now, about 10 years later, you have the American Civil War that goes off on an opposite continent halfway across the world. And you have the Confederates in 1862, very soon after the war breaks out, planning to make a series of trenches and artillery positions about 10 miles long, planning in advance that they would come under siege one day. They are pre-making trench lines, which is a lot like what you would see the Hindenburg Line looking like in World War I, a pre-made trench network knowing what was going to happen. And this Dimmock line, while small and mainly an artillery line instead of an infantry line reinforced with artillery, still features firing steps and reinforced walls. This image here shows one of these artillery positions, and you can see the elevated steps and the reinforced sandbag walls. It's built down. It is exactly a trench network and a trench battery that you would see in World War I. It is just decades beforehand. And again, it's more of an artillery line instead of an infantry line, but it still makes a very deserving part of this list. Now, the Siege of Petersburg happens, and this is where the Dimmock line plays a somewhat of an important part. Not really, but somewhat. So the Union forces come in, they directly charge the Dimmock line with a cavalry unit. The cavalry unit gets thrown back in this absolutely appalling manner, and then the Confederates kind of abandon the line because they see the position as untenable. They need to go defend Petersburg instead. So the Union forces very quickly overrun what's left of the Confederates on the line. They take the super defended position that's been there for like 3 years now, and they move on. Except, as they're moving on, they run into Confederate trenches that are made for infantry. And these Confederate trenches are tens of miles long. They are reinforced not only with sandbags and twigs, but legitimate like tree logs. They are reinforced with firing steps, and they have communication trenches, and they're in depth. And the Union walks right into it and gets absolutely repulsed the first time they come up on these trench lines. So the Union very hastily digs in with their own trenches, and you see a stalemate between two sides with vast trench networks 30 miles long and up to 3 miles long for a continuous trench. In World War I, the single longest trench was also around 3 miles. So the American Civil War has trenches almost to the same scale as World War I and an individual battle level. And it is fascinating. Now, during this extended battle, it's very long compared to all the other battles in the Civil War, you have artillery pinpointing different trench networks on the Confederate side, and artillery from the Confederate side pinpointing the Union side. And the artillery is arcing up and coming back down, meaning that the shells will land in the trenches. So the trenches start to collapse due to their artillery and due to flooding. And there's massive amounts of disease throughout the ranks because they're living in mud. And you have hunger issues because the Confederates can't supply their troops in the trenches. And it is the exact same suffering that you will see in World War I about 50 years later. Also in these trenches, there are around 12 very early model machine guns on the Union side. Now they were spread out, they were not used very effectively, but they were there. This is the very, very early beginning rumblings of what trench warfare would become just a few decades later. Now, the other thing that you see in this battle is in this image here. You can see the reinforced walls with the logs holding up the dirt, and then behind those logs is a big group of people. And in the middle of that group of people, there is like flat planks and a roof and an awning over it. And this is a dugout in an organized trench network. 50 years before World War I was even beginning to have its, startups, 60 years before it would end, this is it. This is identical to World War I trenches, and it's on the same scale as what World War I would come to see at a localized level. And now this image here shows where these siege lines were and just the length of how long they were as well. And I could make a whole video just about the Siege of Petersburg and the trenches that were in it. It is absolutely mind-blowing stuff that we had trenches just like what you would see in World War I, just a little bit different, a little bit less refined, and decades prior, centuries prior, thousands of years prior. So, if anybody asks you, when was the first time trenches were used in warfare? You can say 8000 BC, or you can say 529 AD, or you can say 1673 is when it was organized, or you could say 100 different things. And there's so many examples that we've lost to history, examples that are just lost between, big name titles, and it's really fascinating stuff. So if you enjoyed the video, I hope I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.